Nobody's going to be saying defund the police. I mean, the idea that people were running around talking about defund the police, no cash bail, don't prosecute low-level offenses, look the other way at quality of life, depredations of homeless people sleeping, defecating, doing drugs. That argument is not going to get 30% support at the polls. I think it's over. I think there's some stuff that it advocated that's worth trying to preserve. It's one thing to say we're a colorblind society. It's another thing to say I don't take any notice of racial disparities in imprisonment, income and wealth, participation in elite programs because race doesn't matter. One of those positions, we're a colorblind society and we don't do racial discrimination, is entirely consistent with recognition that there are historical legacies of past depredations which warrant our attention even if we attend to them in colorblind ways. The other is basically saying race is over, let's move on and talk about something else. And I think we're a lot closer to the latter than the former. You think DEI is dying or has had the final nail in its coffin with the Trump election?
Not nail in the coffin, because they'll just start giving things different names, given that DEI is a euphemism for affirmative action already. But yes, something happened this year. And I think it started with what happened last January with Claudine Gay and Harvard and the accusations of plagiarism against her, which led many people to say she had been a DEI hire anyway, which then continued with Christopher Rufo and Bill Ackman and people connected with them finding endless plagiarism in various DEI quote-unquote dissertations. And that helped put the whole structure under a certain magnifying glass. And so, notice that it has a taste in the mouth that it didn't have 2 years ago. Yeah, I think that there's going to be a questioning of how large these DEI organizations get and how much effect they have. And notice especially the falling away of the loyalty oaths that new professors were expected to sign, saying that their work is committed to diversity even when they're particle physicists. I was always dreading that somehow I was going to have to sign one of those because, frankly, I wouldn't. I would leave a job rather than do that. But notice that schools are dropping that requirement. And so that's a good sign, too. What do you think?
Oh, I think the movement, if you could call it that, for diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging for racial equity has taken fatal blows. I think the Supreme Court's decision in that Students for Fair Admissions case was a mortal wound, undercutting the legal foundation for racially conscious public action aimed at producing more equitable or equal results. I think a lot of the rhetoric on behalf of that project, the project of affirmative action and equity, not equality, a lot of the underpinnings for it have been kicked away. I think you mentioned Claudine Gay and the identification of pro-equity, DEI, diversity sentiment in the institutions of higher education with pro-Hamas, anti-Israeli sentiment. That ain't gonna work, man. That dog don't hunt. That's asking for trouble, and I think many of the principals in such institutions have found that trouble by trying to split the difference on these questions. I think the election of Trump and the way in which he was elected, with a lot of support, increase of support in minority communities, has undercut this. I think you're not going to be hearing any serious Democrat talk about reparations for slavery if they have national political aspirations in the future going forward. I think Christopher Rufo, I don't know that much about his background, but I know he's had a tremendous impact on the policy discussion, and I know he's got a lot of support. And, he's shrewd, he's effective. The Manhattan Institute and City Journal have had an outsized impact on the national discussion on these issues. And although I'd say it's all to the good. I mean, it can be a little bit rough around the edges, but, we, if I can say that, are winning this argument. I think if you were to try to do what was done in the summer of 2020 in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, which is to say, burn that BITCH down kind of attitude. You wouldn't find a single prominent Democrat supporting it. What you did find, you're not going to get calls from national political candidates in the Democratic Party to the bedside of miscreants who have gotten into trouble with the police, but gotten into trouble with the police through their own indefensible behavior, consoling them and their families against the depredations of American racism and whatnot. I think you don't even have to bother, and I'll stop. I know I'm going on. You don't even have to bother with defund the police is a bad idea. Nobody's going to be saying defund the police. I mean, the idea that people were running around talking about defund the police, I think the Soros prosecutors, we could name them in city after city around the country, are on the run or have been voted out of, recalled from office, and their program of, no cash bail, don't prosecute low-level offenses, look the other way at quality of life, depredations of, homeless people sleeping, defecating, doing drugs, et cetera, et cetera. That argument is not going to get 30% support at the polls. So, I think it's over. I think there's some stuff that it advocated that's worth trying to preserve, but I actually have my doubts about whether or not it can be preserved. What do I mean? I mean, it's one thing to say we're a colorblind society. It's another thing to say I don't take any notice of racial disparities in imprisonment, income and wealth, participation in elite programs or such and such, because race doesn't matter. One of those positions, we're a colorblind society and we don't do racial discrimination, is entirely consistent with the recognition that there are historical legacies of past depredations which warrant our attention, even if we attend to them in colorblind ways. The other is basically saying race is over. Let's move on and talk about something else. And I think we're a lot closer to the latter than the former. So I think it's epic.
Definitely something's happening, and I hope it's epic. Of course, the way change happens is that there are always going to be the holdouts, and I'm equally struck by them. So, for example, summer of 23, I was surprised. I think I've talked about this here before, so I'll just briefly say that Henry Louis Gates sponsors this discussion on Martha's Vineyard in the summers in August, and he invited me in the summer of 23. And it's a well-heeled, educated, mostly Black audience, a Martha's Vineyard kind of audience. And to be honest, I had gotten used to being able to get through to audiences about what you do with racial preferences in the 21st century. And I just figured, things have changed since my days at Berkeley when I was surrounded by people who were, very hard left on it and, practically assaulting me in the streets sometimes. But, I found that I could not get through to that audience. They were, nobody was throwing anything at me, but my idea that we need to base this now on socioeconomics and it shouldn't be about skin color. Suddenly I was transported back to 1995. It just wasn't going to work. But this was
after the Supreme Court had handed down its decision.
Yeah, this was after the decision. As a matter of fact, that was why we were talking about it. Randall Kennedy, God bless him, would not have any of it and raised his voice after something that I said. Lawrence Tribe bitch slapped me from a monitor. I was just, and, life goes on. But I remember thinking, wow, these people haven't changed on this at all, and they're never going to. Or another example, and I'm going to name a name because nothing bad happened. Where was I? Sometime earlier this year, in March, I was at UT Austin, and I watched our friend Coleman Hughes in conversation with Anil Joseph, who is a Black history professor.
I know who he is.
Written books. Yeah. And, he was friendly, but impenetrable about these things. He was not going to budge. However, I think he and I are about the same age. I wonder if it's different among people a generation below. And I hope it is because, what is the adage that in science, things change by people dying, not by people changing their mind. I with no disrespect, I would have to say some of this might be that kind of thing. There are people who are getting on who I get the feeling just can't move on this. But yes, definitely the conversation has changed a lot over the past couple of years. That's definitely true.